Order. Welcome to the Treasury Select Committee on Wednesday, the 4th of December 2024. Today, we're starting the evidence sessions on our inquiry about cash acceptance in the UK. This is something that's an interesting issue for the committee. During COVID, we saw the use of cash decrease, but we're increasingly seeing businesses that do not accept cash in other parts of society as well. So today, we're hearing from users or representatives of users of cash, people who may need to use cash more than others, and I'm really delighted to welcome our witnesses. Finally, we have Delnevo, who's the chair of the Payment Choice Alliance. So I just wanted to start really with a quick opener to all of you. Do you think that the policymakers, so we're going to be making recommendations to government and others, do you think that they have a really clear understanding of the issues about when cash is not accepted in certain environments of business and elsewhere?
I agree with the other speakers. I think when we were putting our submission to this committee together, we were asked to look at special groups that might be impacted. And to be honest, I had to call a halt to that because there were so many groups impacted by this. And when you add all those groups together, it explains some of the statistics that we're getting in a more general way. Link, the ATM scheme, for the first time, as far as an official body was concerned, asked the question of the public recently, do you want to continue to use cash? It had always been focused on need. 81% said they wanted to have the option to continue to use cash. And when the Payment Choice Alliance surveyed through YouGov last year, 71% of adults said they wanted a law put in place to compel businesses to accept their cash. So this isn't a fringe issue, although there are many groups that do need special consideration. This is the general will of the British public, and I don't think that's fully understood.
Could you tell the committee if there were particular areas that people wanted to use cash for, if you could unpack that 81%?
Well, I think obviously public services. So we're getting a terrible situation now that hundreds of leisure centres around the country, which are owned by local authorities but operated by, ironically, two charities, are cashless. I've actually complained to the Charities Committee commissioners about this, but that's just one example. We've got transport where you cannot buy anything on most trains to eat now because they've gone cashless. There was a move towards station car parks going cashless, but I think the government may have halted that. There's also all of these facilities, the car parking around the country at public facilities, universities going cashless, football clubs going cashless.
People raised a lot of different areas where they...
Massive, yeah, and all around the country. It's stronger in London, I have to say, in the South East, but it's becoming a real problem around the country.
Yeah, we saw it was interesting to see from the evidence of the surveys that have happened about the regional disparities, which we'll come to. Dame Harriet Baldwin and people.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to probe a little bit more, if I may, on Chris Brooks's evidence. And in fact, you've all been really compelling about the types of people who will be excluded if they can't use cash. But specifically about the age distinction that you shared with us just now. I can understand older people who haven't necessarily been brought up in a cashless society, but children today are very much being brought up in cashless situations, and I just wondered how you justify the claim that you made that this will actually continue for generation after generation. Is this not something that will begin to seem archaic over time, because a lot of kids will never have seen anyone in their family use anything other than tapping? Over
50% of pocket money is still paid in cash in this country. So those kids know what cash is.
Okay.
And of Gen Z, 17% of Gen Z still prefer to use cash. So I think there's obviously a lot of more mature people, older if you like, who prefer cash, but I think it's across generations. 16 million people budget using cash, and that's across generations.
Okay, so that's really interesting. And is that you concur with that evidence?
Yeah, I think if you look at the polling, there's still a number of people in younger age groups who are reliant on cash.
Dame Siobhan McDonald, MP.
We've been talking about access to cash and using cash for quite a few years now, and what seems to precipitate it is reports kind of in the media, particularly at the BBC, about the increasing numbers of people using cash in order to help them budget their way through the cost of living crisis. And I just wanted to ask, in your experience in all your agencies, how widespread is the use of cash as a budgeting tool?
Yes, I would just echo what everybody else has said here, that I used to be a trustee of a Citizens Advice Bureau, and we had youngsters coming in there saying, how do we switch off contactless? Because we're just waving these things and we don't realise what we're spending. Whereas if you take £20 out for an evening and it's gone, you spent your £20. So it covers a wide variety of people who are seeking more control over their lives. And the thing is that they know now that if they don't get control at the end of the month when the bill's got to be paid, they have a very unhappy life. So this is about not just paying for things, it's about your whole life and your attitude towards life, how positive you feel. And I'd also echo the thing about, we've had some heartrending stories from people who've got relatives with disabilities, and when they don't get their cash accepted, they feel that it's robbing them of self-esteem. This was their money and they had the right to spend it, and they're being told your money is no good anymore, and they take that as implying that they're no good anymore, and that's a very negative thing. And why should they be robbed of self-esteem because some businesses think it's convenient to turn down cash?
Sure. UK's Finance's most recent payments market report found that for some people, digital budgeting tools are supplanting cash budgeting. Are there any barriers preventing some sections of society from being able to take up these tools? Are financially vulnerable people who rely on cash to budget experience the inequality in access to goods and services because of changes in cash acceptance?
Well, one thing to say is over 8 million people in this country don't have smartphones. So already you're seeing a limit on their ability to participate. And by the way, the statistic doesn't tell the whole story. I was doing a launch of a fintech in Stoke, actually, and we found, many people had smartphones, but they were the wrong type of smartphone because they were actually Chinese smartphones, which were not able to download certain apps because of the row with security issues and so on. So about 50% had cheaper smartphones, and by the way, you need cheaper smartphones because Apple are now charging nearly £1,000, but they couldn't use them for certain things because those phones weren't capable of getting all the apps down from the App Store. So, the participation is vital. There are many people who can't actually use things, not just because they haven't got the skills, but they can't afford the passport to participate. They can't afford £1,000 for a smartphone.
I was particularly taken by something that you said, Mr. Delnevo, about council sports and swimming pool facilities that simply don't take cash, when some of the groups of people that you represent and care for are those who need access to that sort of ability to exercise and feel good about themselves is even greater than for most other people.
Absolutely, and it also points, this idea that you can have a two-speed society where some businesses might be compelled to accept cash and some businesses not. If you look at a leisure centres have cafes, so you can insist, or you can pay for your swim, but if you don't insist that the cafe accepts cash, you can't have the social event afterwards. So I think it's a little bit dangerous to assume that certain things should be left out. One of the reasons we didn't include Ireland as an example of international precedents was that the Irish government's looking at limiting cash, compelling cash acceptance to certain businesses. And a government minister was very struck, an Irish government minister was doing a radio interview, and he said, no, we're not going to cover things like just having a cup of coffee. And I was thinking, there's millions of people who think that going out and having a cup of coffee and socialising is very important. And if we allow businesses, many businesses will adhere if a law is brought in, but if we allow them to have easy escapes like, oh no, this doesn't have to do it because this is a part of our business that doesn't have to accept cash under the law, we're going to end up with lots of arguments that we don't need actually. If you simply make it a rule, cash must be accepted, then all the businesses must do it and they can't argue about it.
Thank you. My final question, should the government legislate, regulate or issue guidance?
legislate for me, as many governments have. I mean, we are actually outliers. The French government have legislated, the Spanish government have legislated, the Slovakian government, the Norwegian government. In America, 8 states have legislated, and they enforce it. In America, an ice cream parlour, although a chain, not just one, they said, oh no, we're not going to accept cash. They had fines in the end of over $100,000 for not accepting them. And believe it or not, now they accept cash. So the fact is that if you don't have legislation, there will be some businesses that try to sneak out of it, and that places more weight on the businesses who continue to be faithful to cash, because cash then becomes more expensive for them. So I don't think any business should be allowed to dodge its responsibility here. And to be fair, many very honourable businesses around this country are saying we are never going to stop accepting cash. But there's a slide towards businesses becoming cashless, and as we've said, especially businesses which are, or organisations which are funded by public money, that cannot be acceptable.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
On the point of leisure centres, Chair, if I may observe, I went to a council leisure centre once which wouldn't take cash but did insist that you had a £1 coin for the locker.
You, Anne Yang MP.
Thank you, Chair. I want to broaden out the point beyond leisure centres to public services, more generally including services subcontracted by local authorities. Mr Delnevo, could you give a broad overview of the changes in cash acceptance in this sector and in particular parts of it over the last decade or so?
Well, bear in mind that this whole thing only started about 12 years ago. Before Uber came to this country and started offering cashless taxi services, and we had the Olympic Games in 2012, which Visa tried to make cashless. They didn't succeed in doing that. Nobody mentioned cashless around this country. Cashless didn't exist for in-person purchases. But what's been happening is, and partly as a result of the pandemic, when there were some false health scares that went around about cash, there's been this creeping thing that's crept into car parking now. So I know some older friends who stopped going to certain places like Bromley in Kent to shop because they couldn't park without having an app. And they don't have apps, they don't have smartphones. And so we've seen parking massively affected. We've seen on-train catering, you can't buy food on trains. We've seen universities, we've seen leisure facilities. We've mentioned all these leisure facilities. Theatres, like the Ambassador Theatre Group have gone cashless. And many of these organisations are supported by the government or local authorities. And that seems wrong, that the general funding of the government or local authorities, which they get from everybody, should actually be used to subsidise businesses which are not allowing everybody locally to use cash. It also affects tourists, by the way, because in most countries in the world, there's no question of cash being accepted. They come to this country, and we've had lots of tourists saying, we got all our foreign currency, our pounds, and we can't use it because so many businesses, particularly in London, are not accepting cash anymore. How is that good for the reputation of Britain that cash isn't accepted?
Thank you, Mr Delnevo. I want to pick up on the point that you made about car parking. Car parking is an issue that comes up frequently on the doorstep in Earley and Woodley constituency. And the Oracle Shopping Centre in the centre of Reading is a cashless car park, for example. I was wondering if you or anyone on the panel has had these conversations with car park operators about the pros and cons of their switch to cashlessness, and if you've gotten any kind of response from them. So,
yes, we have. I mean, we've been... Well, we contacted the railway companies because they were thinking of going cashless, but we also contacted the government at the same time, and the government stepped in and asked them to think again about making station car parks cashless, and the government since assured us that they will not allow that to happen for station car parks. For shopping centres, we've been in touch with one of the biggest operators, NCP, but we've had no response to date because they don't think that they've got a social responsibility. And there's a really ironic thing. One of our supporters persuaded the Imperial War Museum in Manchester to accept cash again, but the car park's operated by NCP and doesn't accept cash. So people coming there who don't have other means to pay are having to drive in and drive out again, and there's nowhere else to park. So, there isn't sufficient consideration given here. They're thinking that they can just ignore the will of the British people, and this has got to stop.
Anyone else?
You mentioned a lot about the social exclusion that's happening as a result of these changes. Do you think it's an oversight by companies and by organisations in the round because of the pandemic, where people were sort of encouraged more to use contactless payment, and actually by having these conversations now in the open, most organisations would agree with you. I mean, your evidence is very compelling. I'm just interested in how you feel, whether it's intention or design, that people are being excluded.
I think the move towards cashless has been quite intentional. You had the debate about assisted dying last week in Parliament, and the assisted death of cash has been going on for quite a long time in this country. Withdrawal of bank services, withdrawal of ATMs, and now the reduction in acceptance. We have to remember that one of the biggest card companies in the world, MasterCard, declared war on cash in 2010. They wanted to see cash disappear entirely. They haven't succeeded, thank goodness, but that's what they intended. So I don't think we should say it's an oversight. I think many responsible businesses that might have brought in measures to start with during the pandemic, like, say, Greggs the Bakers, for example, they quickly retrenched and said, no, we're going back to accepting cash in all our branches because we understand our customers want and need. But there are other businesses like Gales, the bakery company, they made the excuse of the pandemic, and since they've just continued not to accept
You would
cash.
need quite a lot of cash to go to Gales, wouldn't you?
Yeah. Too much for the product, some would say. So that's true, but once again we're back to the want thing. People who are affluent often want to use cash, and why should they be stopped from using it? But you could argue just stop using Gales, which may be unfortunate for Gales.
Let's not get into it.
But you know, there's also the question of not thinking sufficiently through it. We've been in touch with Marks and Spencers. Marks and Spencers do accept cash, but they don't often make that clear in some of their cafes and so on. And we've said to them, why don't you install signs saying cash is welcome? Because you'll have signs saying Visa's welcome and MasterCard. Oh, we're not prepared to do that. And that's causing confusion amongst customers. And confusion means that people feel wary about even offering to pay because they're frightened it will get turned down. And you either walk away or you push it. And most people won't push it, they walk away. So we need clearer signage. And I think you mentioned that earlier too. Where cash is accepted, it should be clear. And where it's not accepted, it should be clear too.
Just quickly on this point, I need to go back to Ms Young. Yeah, but Rachel.
It's on energy costs. Shall I go now?
No, Ms Young.
I just want to go back to the point about local authorities and their subcontracted services. Now, I was wondering if in the panel's dialogues with local authorities, you've ever had the point made back to you that it's a resource issue for local authorities to accept cash, or for their subcontracted services to accept cash. And firstly, what would you say to that argument? Would you buy that argument? Do you think it is a resource issue? And secondly, how do you think central government could help local government better handle cash? So anyone who wants to start?
We've been very lazy in this country over cash acceptance. So we bring out in our submission to this committee the example of buses. London is one of the few major capitals in the world that doesn't accept cash on its buses. In New York, they brought in a fixed fare system so that cash would continue to be used. They brought that in 1969. 55 years later, cash is still accepted on New York buses. That's when people are actually thinking of the future and planning for the future. There's too little of that going on here. There's a kind of move to push cashless, and so they're not thinking about innovations. Around the world, there are innovations available in the cash world that can make cash easier for businesses and easier for the public. And we've got to see more of those innovations in this country. But they're available, we just haven't brought them in. I'll give you one example. There was a big fuss made last year. We're bringing in these super ATMs where every bank's customer can deposit cash. That's something that's been available as a linked transaction for 8 years, since 2016, but the bank's never implemented it. And in other countries, every single Japanese ATM in Japan accepts cash deposits and recycles the cash. And they've been doing recycling since I think 1984. So in this country, hardly any ATM recycles cash. That's an innovation that makes it less expensive to operate, also means that the carbon footprint is reduced. Why isn't that more common? So the innovations are there, let's see them made.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to talk a bit about the stability of the systems that support card payments, and I don't know if this is best place for you, Ron Delnevo. We've had some pretty high-profile failures in recent years. That we had the CrowdStrike incident as well. Yep. How stable is this infrastructure versus cash, would you say?
It's as stable as the men and women manning it. So when the chap who was doing the upgrade to the security in CrowdStrike made a mistake, the whole system crashed. So not very stable. And that's before you take account of the fact that there are now hackers from various parts of the world trying to destabilise the situation. So it's no accident that the Swedish government, and Sweden was meant to be cashless by now, has said that they're not going to go cashless. They've told the banks that they must handle cash again at the branches, and they've advised the Swedish public to keep cash at home because they fear, let's be honest about it, they fear Russian hackers' intervention in their payment systems. They've got some very popular digital payment systems like Swish, but if the hackers get into it, they won't work, and the whole thing could collapse if there's no substitute. And the thing about cash is it doesn't crash. If you've got it, it works.
So just to reiterate that point, you're saying that cash is a form of sort of civil preparedness and is needed as a defensive manoeuvre in the way the world is at the moment. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, but not just me. I was talking to Alistair Cairns, the Veterans Minister, and he told me when I spoke to him at the Labour Party conference that cash is an essential part of national security. And in this day and age, in an uncertain world, it's getting more and more uncertain. So, yeah.
That's very helpful, thank you. And so if we were to transition to a world that was entirely cashless, it seems like there's some regulation changes and some banking policy changes internally to ensure they do. Does anyone else in the panel want to pick up anything in particular that is holding people from opening bank accounts that you think should be changed?
I think one thing to say, I mean, I read that there's so many statistics like 1.2 million people don't have bank accounts in the UK. But one does, and echoing the last point, one has to be very careful about stats like that because how many of the accounts that are open are actually being used and can be used in a way that helps the customer. I think in India, actually, they were claiming at one stage a massive improvement in financial inclusion because of all the bank accounts. And then when they did an analysis, almost 50% of those bank accounts were never being used. So it was a mythological, if you like, an illusionary inclusion. The other thing to say, I think we need to be very careful about using the word transition here. This isn't like moving from analogue TV to digital TV. Losing cash would be a fundamental change to our society. It would affect all sorts of things like civil liberties, privacy and so on that we need to take very great account of. And if you look at troubled parts of the world, it's interesting how people who are trying to resist, in some cases, undemocratic governments, for example, they switch back to using cash because they cannot be tracked using cash as opposed to other methods. So I don't think we should regard this as a simple technical issue of transitioning. This is a fundamental change to our society which many believe should not happen. Can we just one other thing about how banks behave? The building societies are so much better. I left Lloyds Bank when they closed their branch locally and I moved to Nationwide. I went in to open my account. They said, oh, you can do it online. I said, oh, okay. And he said, but actually, if you want to, let's do it right now in the branch. That never happens in the high street banks. They opened it in a few minutes working with a customer, and that is so different from the mutuals to what's happening with the high street banks. They want you to go home and do it online, but if you haven't got access to online, as we were hearing earlier, how can you open the account? So you don't have that trouble with the building society, so we need to build up the building society movement again in this country because it's been a sad loss, quite frankly.
A number of Labour co-op MPs around the table might well agree with them on that, but we're going to have to get into the politics of it.
Can I ask all of you to make formal representations by letter to those three organisations about this important point?
We
already has.
We have spoken to the FCA and we've told Sheldon Mills at the FCA he'll be getting our proposals for the viability of cash going forward, and one of those proposals is to do with banking hubs. The problem we've got with banking hubs is it's great that they're open, and Natalie Sine has done a great job persuading the banks and the post office to participate, but the numbers envisaged at the moment are wholly inadequate.
And you don't qualify for a banking hub if there's an access to a cash point. So could you all please make that point?
Mr Delnevo, you mentioned earlier about what they're doing in other countries. If you've got any evidence, nothing that's not necessarily very sophisticated, if you can point us in the direction of countries that are doing this well, I think you mentioned Japan as one example, that would be very helpful because we may want to do some international comparisons about smart cash points, which might solve some of the points
to
that David
make clear the numbers, we believe that 1,200 banking hubs are needed in this country, and at the moment we're talking about 350 by 2029, and that's not going to cover the country. And also these super ATMs, as they're called, they were celebrating last week, they got 50 out, and that's a good start, but they need thousands of those around the country. So, and we need an economic solution as well. If we just come up with solutions which paper over the cracks and aren't economic, then they'll fall down, and we can't have that.
But they're not in the criteria for banking hubs.
Exactly, they're not.
So please, can you all make these powerful representations?
And we have obviously our voice as a
I
committee.
think that's great coming from an MP. That's great, because we've been saying for where is the specification of banking hubs?
Okay, well,
I'm glad you raised that point on air here, because we will take it up.
There's increasing alienation from politics and the system and stuff. And one of the conspiracy theories, which seems to be, in great currency, is that the government is determined to, any government, irrespective of party, government is determined to make us a cashless society. Do we need to challenge that conspiracy theory by enabling the use of cash or easier use of cash?
There is no conspiracy going on. There's a plan that commercial organisations have in place that they're operating, and the public interest is not being served. So the government, yes, need to make clear that they will look after the public interest, and if they're looking after the public interest, they will make sure this is not a cashless society, that cash is available and usable.